Max, you were the project manager. It's whether you're responsible for the failure of the task due to lack of planning, and this was a planning task.
I don't by any means think that I am solely responsible for the failure of this task. I actually think the contrary to that. You said yourself that the failure of this task, a lot of it was down to the fines. 2 of the 3 fines sat with the sub-team.
Lord Sugar, I took a risk. In business, it's all about taking risks. The boat hook was £13 and it could have paid off. Max, however, did not take the risk on getting the wine, which is ultimately the failure of the task.
I took a big risk going forward and putting myself as project manager, Liam.
Carlo, not the most popular person amongst your peers here. So you tell me what your position is, because there's talk of you being disruptive.
I understand your concern, Lord Sugar. I feel in some ways I'm being suppressed. I think people know that I may be a threat and I can have a massive impact on this process.
A threat?
Yes.
What have you shown as far as shrewdness and entrepreneurship to be seen as a threat?
Well, Lord Sugar, if you look at the task that we just had now, it was one of the best negotiations, and there was a reason for that.
Only for one thing, was the quill.
Only for one thing, Lord Sugar, because I was restricted by the project manager.
My argument would be that when I announced what the sub-teams were and that I was putting Liam in charge, you didn't speak up at that particular moment. I completely accept at the start of the day, Carlo, you said I want to be project manager or sub-team leader. That was it.
So you want me to
in
repeat
Carlo's
myself?
defence, Carlo couldn't really put himself forward as the sub-team because Max had said clearly that he wanted to keep an eye on him throughout the day.
No, I didn't. I reject that. I reject that. I didn't say that in the meeting.
No. This is the way it's going to go.
I've had enough of listening to this. I'm going to summarise, and I don't want to hear from anybody. Liam, whilst you were responsible for half the fines, you tried to be an entrepreneur, you tried to come up with some idea about the boat hook, and so you are remaining in the process.
Thank you, Lord Sugar.
Carlo, you're a disruptor, as far as I'm concerned. When you get messages from a few people about you, it's difficult to ignore. Max, I'm afraid that the failure of this task is a lot down to you, because you are the project manager and you made a couple of fatal errors as far as I was concerned. So, you know, I can't overlook that. I'm really torn. This is difficult for me. And I just have to go from a gut feeling about how far you, Carlo, can get in this process. My gut feeling tells me that, Carlo, you're fired.
Thank you, Lord Sugar. Barnes, Brady, Tim, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
One thing for sure, Max, is that your scapegoat's gone now, right? I got my eyes on you, Max. Not convinced, not absolutely convinced, but at the moment, both of you can go back to the house.
Thank you, Lord Sugar. Tim, Karen.